On a clear June morning in 2015, a 32-year-old graphic designer named Emily Parker locked her apartment door in Scottsdale, slung a small day pack over her shoulder, and drove north toward the Tonto National Forest. She told friends she just needed a day on the trail to clear her head. By that evening, when the sun dropped behind the pines and the air slipped down into the low 70s, Emily still hadn't come home. Her car was found neatly parked at a ranger station. The logbook showed her signature at a popular trailhead. Beyond that, there was nothing, no calls, no texts, no bank activity. Search teams and helicopters scoured miles of forest, but it was as if she had stepped off the Highline Trail and simply vanished into the trees. For 3 years, Emily's family lived inside that silence. Birthdays passed, holidays came and went, and the line on the missing persons poster slowly faded under desert sun. The file stayed open, but hope thinned with every season that rolled through the mountains. Then, on an ordinary patrol in June of 2018, 2 park rangers, Tom Reyes and April Donovan, pushed into a remote drainage nearly 8 miles from the trail. The undergrowth was thick, the slopes steep, the kind of place day hikers never see. Under a tall ponderosa pine, they stopped. Leaning against the trunk was a woman in a torn green shirt, bare feet in the dirt. Her body so thin she almost disappeared into the shadows. Her eyes were half open, her breathing shallow, her skin gray and sunken. She looked like she'd been out there for decades. It was Emily Parker. If you're listening to this right now, let me know where you're tuning in from, and if you've ever felt something in the wilderness you just couldn't explain, share it in the comments. In the years before her disappearance, Emily Parker lived a quiet, predictable life in a modest Scottsdale apartment complex shaded by old mesquite trees. At 32 years old, she worked as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm, the kind of place where the lights flickered after rain, and everyone knew when the break room coffee was fresh. Coworkers described her as steady, polite, and a little worn down by long deadlines. She wasn't the type to make impulsive decisions or take unnecessary risks. When she needed to clear her head, she drove north, up past Fountain Hills, past the sprawl toward the pine country she'd loved since childhood. Emily shared the apartment with Sarah Milton, a 29-year-old nursing student who kept strange hours and often relied on Emily's quiet routines to anchor the household. Their schedules rarely aligned, but they understood one another in the way long-term roommates sometimes do respectfully from a distance. On the night before Emily vanished, Sarah remembered her packing a small day-pack water, a light jacket, a few snacks, and mentioning a hike along the Highline Trail. It wasn't unusual. Emily had grown up in northern Arizona, and weekend hikes were part of her normal rhythm. Emily's parents, Ron and Linda Parker, lived nearly 2 hours away in Prescott Valley. Ron, 67, was a retired Forest Service employee who had spent decades navigating the mountains and canyons of the state. He'd taught Emily how to read topographic maps, how to judge weather by the smell of the air, and why a person should always sign into trail logs even on the shortest walks. Linda, 65. A former school librarian trusted Emily's sense of caution. She always said her daughter was the careful one, even as a kid. The Highline Trail stretching through the Tonto National Forest was familiar ground to Ron. The region drew hikers with its pink granite slopes, tall ponderosa pines, and sweeping ridgelines that dipped toward shadowed canyons. It wasn't untouched wilderness, but it wasn't forgiving either. Trails forked unexpectedly, storms built without warning, and the terrain could turn rough within a few hundred feet. People around the state respected that landscape. They loved it, but they feared it when things went wrong. On the morning of June 14, 2015, Emily left home shortly after sunrise. Scottsdale was already warming, but up north, the air still hovered around the low 70s, perfect hiking weather. Security footage would later show her stepping out of the apartment building, wearing a faded green shirt, dark trail pants, and boots that had seen years of use. She looked relaxed, almost relieved to be heading out. There was nothing hurried or anxious in her movements. By 9:30 a.m., She signed her name at a ranger station on the eastern side of the trailhead. A logbook entry recorded beneath several others from that morning. The ranger working that shift, Mark Ellison, then 54, remembered her because she had asked specifically about water sources along the first few miles. She nodded through his explanation, thanked him in the way hikers often do, and stepped onto the trail. Nothing about that moment suggested trouble. In the years since, investigators would examine that morning in microscopic detail. Every passing comment, every recorded timestamp, every weather note. But at the time, it was just another hiker heading out into one of Arizona's most traveled forest corridors. The roads were dry, the skies were clear, and the forecast showed no storm activity. Conditions were about as safe as that region ever offered. Friends later described that time in Emily's life as heavy but manageable. Work was demanding, and she often stayed late to meet deadlines, but she wasn't in crisis. She wasn't avoiding anyone. She wasn't known to take reckless detours. Her plans that day fit exactly who she'd always been, a woman seeking quiet, not adventure. Even so, subtle cracks had begun to show. Sarah recalled Emily looking overly tired that week, her shoulders tight from hours hunched over a computer screen. She'd mentioned needing space, needing stillness. She loved the forest because it didn't ask anything of her. Ron thought that maybe she was overworked, but not distressed. Linda assumed she simply needed fresh air. None of them viewed the hike as unusual. None of them imagined that the signature in the logbook would be the last recorded trace of her for years. At midday, hikers passed through the same sections Emily had entered hours earlier. Families moved along the trail with dogs and trekking poles. No one reported anything out of place. No abandoned gear, no sign of injury, no calls for help echoing in the canyons. The forest looked exactly as it always did, quiet, steady, indifferent. And that was part of the trouble. Indifference in a landscape that large can swallow a person whole. Even experienced hikers understood that once you stepped off the marked path, even unintentionally, the forest didn't offer easy clues. Sound carried strangely. Distances shifted. Familiar markers vanished within feet. Emily knew that terrain, but mountains don't honor familiarity. They don't honor confidence or experience or habit. They just exist, stretched across miles of rugged slopes and shadowed pockets deeper than they appear on a map. By early evening, when Emily still hadn't returned, her absence didn't immediately raise alarms. Traffic could slow someone down. Cell service could drop. But when Sarah's messages went unanswered, and when repeated calls went straight to voicemail, the steady quiet of Emily's life began to feel different, off balance, strangely hollow. And by midnight, when Ron Parker arrived in Scottsdale after speeding down from Prescott Valley, the early edges of panic began to form. He walked the apartment, checked her belongings, retraced her route on a map. He knew the forest. He knew how it swallowed sound. He knew how light failed under the large pines. And he knew something was wrong. Normal life had ended abruptly and without warning. The familiar routines, morning coffee, shared hallway greetings, reliable work schedules were replaced with a widening, echoing silence. Within hours, the trailhead would be surrounded by vehicles, search teams, and volunteers. But for the moment, there was only a father staring at the trail map of the Highline corridor, wondering how his daughter could walk into a clear June morning and simply disappear. On the night Emily Parker failed to come home, time seemed to slow in a way that made every small sound feel louder than it should have been. By 10:00 p.m., the lights in her Scottsdale apartment complex had gone still. Her roommate Sarah Milton stood at the kitchen counter staring at her phone, refreshing her messages over and over. Every call she placed went straight to voicemail. Each text, "Where are you? Are you okay?" remained unread. By 11:15 p.m., Sarah stopped pretending it was nothing. She stepped outside onto the walkway, feeling the warm desert air settling into the courtyard, and called Emily's parents. Ron and Linda Parker were already heading for bed in Prescott Valley when the phone rang. Ron listened without interrupting as Sarah explained the unanswered calls, the silence, the unease. Within minutes, Ron was in his truck, driving south through dark stretches of highway, where the only movement came from the occasional jackrabbit cutting across the asphalt. He knew the forests. He knew the way people disappeared when something went wrong out there. He drove faster. He reached Scottsdale sometime after 2:00 a.m. The apartment was painfully quiet. Emily's work tablet sat open on the counter. Her keys were gone. Her hiking boots were missing the same pair she always wore on northern trails. Nothing else suggested she'd planned more than a day trip. Ron moved through each room as though he might find her tucked behind the bedroom door, caught in some misunderstanding. But everything looked ordinary. Too ordinary. By dawn, the Scottsdale Police Department posted an officer at the apartment complex. Their initial posture was cautious. Most missing adults showed up within hours, they reminded the family. Maybe she'd camped overnight. Maybe her phone battery died. But Ron shook his head each time. Emily never stayed out without calling. Not once. Not in 32 years. At first light, Ron and Sarah drove to the trailhead at the eastern side of the Highline Trail. Emily's silver sedan was there, parked neatly locked, undisturbed. That was the moment the situation shifted from concern to fear. A ranger named Mark Ellison met them outside the small wooden station. He pulled the logbook from under the counter and opened it to the page where hikers had signed in the previous morning. There it was written in Emily's careful print, E. Parker, 9:27 a.m. Nothing followed it. No exit time. No second signature. All movement stopped after that one line. Ellison stepped outside, scanning the tree line as though she might suddenly appear, hiking poles in hand, grinning about some embarrassing mix-up. But the forest had no answers to give. Within an hour, he radioed for search and rescue. By mid-morning, the trailhead was crowded with volunteers, deputies, and Forest Service personnel. Trucks lined the dirt lot, and maps were spread over vehicle hoods. The sun sat high enough to cut hard shadows across the gravel. Search crews began where Emily had last been seen, moving east along the Highline Trail in two-person teams. They branched off at major junctions, marking their progress with orange tape. From above, a helicopter circled its blades, thinning the air to a mechanical heartbeat. Dogs were brought in, German shepherds trained to track human scent, and handlers guided them down washes and ridgelines. But an early warning sign emerged within the first mile. The dogs lost her scent. The trail was broad and clear, dotted with footprints from dozens of hikers. Emily's tracks, if still present, were buried under newer prints. Even the helicopter's thermal cameras returned clean, empty scans. By the end of the first full day, the search radius stretched nearly 5 miles. Every campsite, creek bed, and lean-to within that range had been checked. Nothing. As darkness fell, temperature dropped quickly into the low 60s degrees, and the pines stood like tall silhouettes against a darker sky. Flashlights bounced through the understory. Radios crackled. Ron remained at the trailhead, pacing tight circles around Emily's car. The doors were locked, the tank half full. Her phone was not inside. No sign of struggle. No indication she'd met anyone. Just absence. The next morning, Tonto Rim Search and Rescue expanded the grid. They brought in a drone unit, experienced trackers, and another helicopter. A new assembly point was established farther down the trail. Fresh volunteers arrived, most from nearby Payson and Pine teachers, retirees, local hikers who knew the terrain and refused to stay home. The work was slow, unforgiving. This section of the forest was uneven, a patchwork of steep ridges, boulder fields, and thick stands of manzanita where the branches hooked into clothing like needles. As hours stretched into days, the human cost became visible. Searchers sat on tailgates, wiping dust from their eyes. Deputies knelt in the shade, drinking warm, bottled water. Ron stood with folded maps, recalculating paths that had already been walked. On the third day, a volunteer thought he spotted fabric caught in a juniper tree roughly 2 miles off trail. teams converged. For a moment, everyone's breath held. It was only a sun-bleached scrap of tarp left behind by an old hunter's camp. False alarms became a pattern, small, quick bursts of hope that dissolved just as fast. A hiker reported hearing a woman calling for help, only for deputies to discover it was the echo of teenagers across a canyon. Someone else believed they'd seen a set of footprints near a shallow creek, but the tracks belonged to a pair of hikers from the previous afternoon. Weather held steady, clear skies, light winds, but it didn't help. The forest remained still, as though absorbing the search efforts rather than revealing anything. By the 6th day, the official incident commander made the announcement, "No family wants to hear the search was being scaled back." They had covered more terrain than Emily could reasonably reach on foot in a single day. They had found no clues, no disturbances, no dropped items, no clothing, not even a bent twig that suggested someone had passed through in distress. Silence radiated across the clearing. Ron stared down at the dirt palms pressed against his knees. Sarah turned away when reporters stepped forward, offering no statement. But Ron did not stop. For weeks afterward, he returned to the Highline Trail alone, or with small groups of friends. The routine became its own ritual: drive to the lot, check the map, walk the same miles, glance at the same empty turnouts. Sometimes he ventured beyond the official grids into steeper ravines where the underbrush thickened and the air cooled. He carried flyers in the back of his truck and posted them at every rest stop between Payson and Phoenix. Her picture, bright smile, dark hair, looked increasingly out of place against the plywood of gas station bulletin boards. By autumn, the search reports thinned into monthly check-ins. Deputies followed up on occasional tips, a rumor of a campsite off Forest Road 300, a hiker who thought he saw a woman matching Emily's description near Houston Mesa Road, an abandoned boot found near a trail junction. Every lead collapsed. The boot belonged to a teenage camper. The campsite was nothing more than an old fire ring overgrown with weeds. The supposed sighting was a misremembered encounter from the year before. Local newspapers wrote short updates on the 1-year anniversary. Each article repeated the same facts: clear weather, popular trail, no evidence, no clues. Online comment sections filled with speculation: had she left voluntarily, met someone, fallen into a ravine? No one checked. Investigators addressed each theory, but nothing pointed anywhere concrete. Meanwhile, Emily's car sat in the ranger station lot until it was eventually towed back to her family's home, where it remained untouched inside the garage. Her bank account showed no activity. Her phone never connected to any network. There was no sign of travel, no record of transportation, no communication from her. It was as if the forest had swallowed her and sealed the opening behind her. In 2016, Ron organized a renewed volunteer search with help from a nonprofit that specialized in locating missing hikers. People from across Arizona arrived: experienced backpackers, retired firefighters, off-duty officers, and residents who simply felt compelled to help. They spaced themselves across ridgelines, searched new drainages, combed through cliff bases and narrow saddles. Again, nothing. In 2017, the family hired a private investigator, Daniel Brewer, a former sheriff's detective known for methodical case reconstruction. Brewer walked every mile recorded in the original search grids, reread every interview transcript, spoke to hikers who had been on the trail that day. He produced a sober report: either an untraceable accident had occurred in terrain too remote to reach, or foul play had taken her somewhere the search teams never thought to look. Neither conclusion provided comfort. Through those long months, the Parker home became a place suspended between two realities: life continuing as required, and life refusing to move forward. Linda kept Emily's room exactly as it had been. Ron kept the maps on the kitchen table. Friends who visited felt the weight of questions hanging in every quiet moment. And the forest, sitting miles away, remained unchanged, ridges rising and falling in the sun, shadows pooling at dusk, wind carrying secrets no one could hear. Nothing connected to Emily surfaced: not her pack, not her boots, not a single trace of disturbed pine needles or broken brush. By the time the third summer arrived, even the most seasoned search coordinators admitted privately that they no longer knew what they were looking for. Emily Parker had vanished in broad daylight in ideal weather on a well-traveled trail with no evidence left behind. And for 3 years that silence held its shape unbroken, unmoving, impenetrable. For nearly 3 years, the case of Emily Parker sat in the cold files of the Arizona Investigative System, quiet, undisturbed, and largely untouched except for the occasional review by a detective unwilling to let it fade. Her family had settled into a painful routine of waiting, never fully letting go, but no longer expecting the phone to ring with news. Even seasoned search teams, the ones who had once walked miles of rugged terrain for her, no longer spoke of the case except in hushed, regretful tones. And then, in June of 2018, something shifted. It happened on a warm morning when the air was already carrying the scent of sun-baked pine. 2 Tonto National Forest Rangers, Caleb Monroe, age 41, and Denise Holt, age 37, set out for a routine patrol through an isolated drainage roughly 8 miles southeast of the High Line Trail. It was a place few hikers ever saw, a steep stretch of broken ridges and dense underbrush that made travel slow and disorienting. Fallen trees crisscrossed the slope like barricades, and the sound of the wind threaded through the pines in long, low notes. Their assignment was unremarkable check for illegal campsites, verify fire safety conditions, and inspect an area prone to dry lightning strikes later in the summer. Both had walked versions of this route before. Neither expected anything unusual. In fact, the forest felt so still that morning that Denise later described it as a kind of quiet that presses on your ribs. About an hour into the patrol, they approached a tall ponderosa pine with a broad, flaking trunk. At first glance, Caleb noticed only what looked like a pile of torn fabric slumped at its base. Colorless, motionless. He almost kept walking, but Denise slowed, raising a hand. Something about the shape was wrong. As they stepped closer, the shadows thinned and the outline sharpened into the unmistakable form of a seated human body, legs, extended arms limp at the sides, back braced against the tree as though the person had simply run out of strength mid-movement. The shirt, what little remained of it, had once been green. The skin was pale, almost gray. For a suspended moment, neither ranger spoke. Then Caleb crouched and reached for a pulse. Faint, barely there, but present. The woman's eyes were partially open, staring past them at nothing. She was painfully thin, her cheeks sunken. Her collarbones pronounced her wrists little more than bone under papery skin. Her feet were bare cut and bruised from exposure. Her breathing came in uneven, shallow pulls that made her chest lift only slightly with each movement. The forest around them seemed to draw tight, as if holding breath. Denise radioed for medical evacuation immediately. The dispatcher asked for clarification. Was this a recent injury? Did the woman appear lost? Denise answered slowly, carefully. No. She looks like she's been out here for a long time. Within 40 minutes, a rescue team arrived by helicopter, lowering paramedics on ropes because ground access was impossible. They wrapped the woman in thermal blankets. They started fluids. They checked for injuries, then checked again, unable to comprehend how someone could be alive in such a condition. No one spoke her name. No one even considered the possibility. Not yet. Back in Phoenix at Desert Valley Medical Center, a trauma nurse noticed a small scar along the woman's left forearm, an identifying detail that matched an old missing persons bulletin still preserved in the hospital's digital archive. Another nurse pulled up the file. The image taken years earlier was of a healthy, smiling woman in her early 30s. The match was unmistakable. It was Emily Parker. 3 years missing. 3 years without a signal, a footprint, a clue. And now she was lying in a bed just miles from where her life had once been ordinary. Detectives were contacted immediately. The first on site was Detective Frank Mallory, 52. a veteran investigator who had reviewed Emily's case numerous times despite having little evidence to work with. When the call came, he assumed he'd heard wrong. Most long-term missing hikers were found deceased if they were found at all, but the nurse on the line repeated it clearly. She's alive, but she's in critical condition. Emily's parents arrived not long after. Ron entered the ICU in a state of stunned disbelief, standing at the threshold of the room before approaching the bed. The figure lying beneath the blankets looked nothing like the woman he had raised, nothing like the daughter who had once trotted behind him on mountain trails near Prescott. The shock rippled outward quickly. Local news outlets caught wind of the discovery within hours. Reporters waited outside the hospital. Online forums reignited with speculation. Law enforcement agencies that had once exhausted their efforts began reassigning personnel back onto the case. For investigators, the implications were staggering. Emily had not wandered away briefly. She had not been injured and unable to return. She had not started a new life elsewhere. Wherever she had been, whatever had happened out there, she had survived for 3 full years in one of Arizona's most unforgiving wilderness regions, despite dehydration, malnutrition, injuries, and near-total isolation. And she had been found in a location the original search crews hadn't covered, deep in terrain so rugged that it would have taken tremendous effort to reach it. Effort far beyond what her condition suggested she could have mustered alone. Detective Mallory drove to the discovery site the next morning with a small team. The forest felt different now, less like a place of empty silence, and more like a crime scene stretched across miles. Standing beneath the ponderosa pine, he studied the ground, the depressions in the soil, the absence of anything resembling a shelter or gear. He looked at the slope, the direction of the wildlife paths, the density of the brush. None of it made sense. How had she survived there? How had she avoided being seen during the search operations? And perhaps most troubling, had she been alone? Mallory didn't say any of this aloud. But investigators exchanged glances. The questions were too obvious to ignore. The discovery shifted the case from a presumed wilderness accident to something far more complicated. Something that hinted at long-term survival under circumstances beyond simple disorientation or injury. For the Parker family, hope returned in an overwhelming surge tempered by fear of the unknown condition of Emily's mind and body, fear of the answers that might emerge. They had prepared themselves for many outcomes. Not this one. For the community, the late discovery reopened a wound thought to be closed. A case once believed unsolvable was suddenly very much alive again, demanding the attention of search teams, detectives, psychologists, and forensic experts. And for law enforcement, the find altered every previous assumption. What they thought they knew about Emily's disappearance no longer aligned with the evidence. The terrain they believed had been thoroughly searched was not as complete as once assumed. Someone who should have been found had remained hidden. Now the investigation had to begin again, this time from the end rather than the beginning. The forest had finally given something back, but it had not yet told the truth. When detectives finally had Emily Parker stabilized in a Phoenix hospital, they expected answers to come quickly. After all, 3 years is a long time for a case to sit dormant. A living survivor, no matter how fragile, should have brought clarity. Instead, it brought more questions than anyone was prepared for. Emily could barely speak in those early days. Her voice came out as a faint whisper, sometimes no louder than the hum of the heart monitor beside her bed. Doctors explained that prolonged malnutrition, isolation, and psychological trauma could all contribute to delayed responsiveness. Detectives had no choice but to wait. While they waited, investigators turned to the one place where answers might still exist, the forest where she was found. Return to the drainage. Detective Frank Mallory, along with a small forensic team, hiked back into the deep drainage, where rangers had discovered Emily. This time, they moved slowly, mapping every foot of ground, documenting every indentation in the soil. The steep slope made travel difficult. Even fit searchers had trouble keeping their footing. The idea that Emily in her condition had reached this place alone felt implausible on its face. Roughly 40 yards downhill from where she was found, analysts located the remnants of a crude fire pit, blackened stones arranged in a loose ring. A few charred animal bones remained at the edges. The bones were later confirmed to be from small game common in the area, rabbit rodent, possibly quail. Nearby forensic technicians found a plastic rainwater catchment fashioned from cut tarp pieces tied between fallen limbs. It wasn't professional by any means, but it was effective. Someone had collected enough water to survive extended periods. The deeper they looked, the more the area revealed signs of long-term habitation. A shallow depression lined with pine needles likely used as a sleeping hollow, several torn articles of clothing not matching Emily's known items, a length of cord knotted in a way that suggested repeated makeshift use, bark markings carved into the side of a cedar tree, small horizontal lines grouped by tens as if someone had been counting days. Then came the discovery that changed the tone of the investigation entirely: the second campsite. About a quarter-mile east of the tree where Emily was found behind a cluster of juniper bushes, investigators uncovered a more structured campsite. This one was different, deliberate, organized, and lived in for a significant period of time. They found a weathered tarp roof strung between branches, a stool carved from a tree stump, several animal bones cleaned and stacked, a battered metal pot with soot coating its underside, a pair of boots that clearly would not have fit Emily, a small notebook protected inside a rusted tin. When technicians opened the notebook, they discovered page after page of slanted handwriting, uneven, erratic, but legible enough to decipher. Most entries were fragmented thoughts about survival, weather patterns, movement through the forest. But approximately halfway through, the language changed. The writer referenced the girl multiple times, making matter-of-fact notes about watching her, tracking her, and keeping her from wandering too far. There was no name, no identifying details about who this writer was, but the implication was unmistakable. Investigators photographed everything, bagged the notebook, preserved soil samples, and took swabs from the boots and tarp. DNA would soon confirm the most alarming detail of all: another person had been living in that forest with Emily, reconstructing the unknown presence. DNA analysis returned one clear profile, not Emily's. It belonged to an unidentified adult male. No criminal record, no match in any federal or state database. This discovery reframed the entire timeline. Detectives now believed Emily had not been lost alone. She had not simply drifted into the wilderness and become disoriented. She had been accompanied, and by the wording in the notebook, likely controlled, monitored, or restrained in ways she may not have been able to articulate. But without the man present, investigators could only reconstruct events using physical evidence. Two distinct campsites existed at different elevations. One campsite, the more organized one, appeared to be the shelter of the unidentified male. The other, the rough hollow and fire pit, seemed more consistent with survival improvisation made by someone in duress. The notebook's passages described watching Emily from a distance, adjusting her paths, and at one point stopping her from trying to leave. Investigators could not find any signs of force bindings or weapons. But the forest is not a clean environment. Evidence deteriorates rapidly in heat, rain, and wind. Still, the existence of two separate living areas, the notebook's tone and the DNA, were enough to elevate the case from a missing person mystery to a criminal investigation. Interviewing Emily, weeks passed before Emily could speak in sentences. Even then, her memories came in disjointed fragments like pieces of a dream glimpsed through fog. Detective Mallory sat beside her bed for short interviews, never longer than 10 minutes at a time. Emily often stared at the window when she tried to recall details, as though the outside light pulled her attention away. Her statements were consistent, though incomplete. She remembered waking somewhere unfamiliar, not the trail. She remembered someone bringing her food small portions irregularly. She remembered being watched, feeling she was never alone even when she couldn't see anyone. She recalled attempting to flee more than once, but always failing. Her memories of time were blurred. She described days melting together, nights spent awake, and stretches when her thoughts felt interrupted or broken apart. When Mallory asked whether she remembered the man, Emily would fall silent, then shake her head. Sometimes her hands trembled. Doctors explained that trauma-related memory fragmentation could make identification impossible. The breakthrough had to come from the physical evidence, not from her recollection. Revisiting the search failure. One of the most difficult questions investigators needed to answer was how Emily and the unknown man had remained hidden during the massive search operations in 2015. The terrain provided part of the explanation. The drainage where Emily was found sat between two steep ridges, each rising more than 400 feet. It was an area the original search teams had judged too far for a single-day hiking route. They had never fully combed it. But another element soon emerged. The second campsite was positioned in a way that gave an occupant a clear vantage point of the approach trails. Anyone living there could have seen searchers long before being noticed themselves and chosen to remain still or move deeper into cover. The notebook made several references to noise in the hills, people passing through and waiting until quiet returns. It was chilling to imagine that searchers had been within earshot of both campsites and never known. Mallory noted in his report, the second party may have intentionally evaded detection. Expanding the search for the unknown. Male. Even with no name and no face, detectives built a behavioral profile. Male, likely 40 to 60 years old, skilled at wilderness survival, capable of constructing makeshift tools and shelters, demonstrated long-term isolation tendencies. Viewed Emily as someone to monitor or control, exhibited organized and disorganized traits simultaneously. Search units deployed trail cameras throughout the region. A small task force reviewed missing person records going back a decade. Men with a history of mental illness, wilderness, isolation, or off-grid living. Nothing matched. Officers patrolled the drainage for weeks, armed and cautious. They found no fresh footprints, no new campsites, no signs of recent fire. If the unknown male had watched Emily for months or years, he was now gone. Emily's slow return to speech. By late 2018, Emily had begun recalling slightly clearer fragments. She didn't remember days or months. She remembered sensations, hunger, cold thirst, footsteps around her at night, a voice she could never quite understand. Sometimes she remembered a silhouette. Other times she remembered hands guiding her to sit, then disappear again. She never remembered a name, never remembered a face, never remembered the moment she went missing. Doctors explained that prolonged trauma can fracture a timeline so completely that memory functions become nonlinear. Detectives hoped for more, but they accepted what little they had. Reconstructing the final timeline. With all available evidence, campsites, DNA, notebook entries, Emily's fragmented statements, investigators pieced together the most likely chain of events. It was not definitive, but it was the closest approximation to truth the evidence allowed. June 14, 2015. Emily begins her hike. At some point, she encounters the unidentified male or becomes disoriented and crosses paths with him. The exact moment remains unknown. Summer 2015. 2016. Emily is kept under watch, possibly coerced, possibly psychologically overpowered. The notebook references keeping her from wandering too far, which investigators interpreted as control rather than mutual survival. 2016. 2017. The two campsites become established, suggesting prolonged habitation. The unknown male gathers resources, builds structures, and maintains minimal fire use to avoid detection. 2017. 2018. Emily experiences severe physical decline. Notebook entries become more erratic. The last legible note says only, "She isn't moving much now." June 9, 2018. Emily is found alone. The male is absent. Investigators estimate he left days or possibly weeks before the discovery. No one knows why. The forest did not give that answer. Theories considered and ruled out. Because investigators could only rely on documented evidence, they pursued every angle with caution. 1. Voluntary disappearance ruled out. Emily had food, water, and supplies at home. She had no history of off-grid behavior. She had no financial withdrawals. Her condition proved she had not lived independently. 2. Injury leading to confusion ruled out. Forensics showed signs of long-term support from another person. 3. Mutual survival partnership ruled out. Notebook language clearly indicated surveillance and restriction of movement. 4. Abduction with psychological control considered most likely. Though Emily never confirmed a kidnapping, the behavioral evidence supported an involuntary situation. 5. Captor death before 2018 possible but unproven. No remains were found. No indication of injury. 6. Captor fleeing once Emily weakened plausible but unconfirmed. Given the organization of the camps, investigators believed the unknown male left intentionally. In Mallory's final report, he wrote, "The individual responsible for Emily Parker's prolonged isolation remains unidentified. Evidence suggests extensive experience in wilderness survival and deliberate evasion of contact. Aftermath. A case without a name." By 2019. Trail cameras recorded occasional movement-blurred images of a person passing quickly across narrow clearings. None were sharp enough to identify. None showed a face. Rangers could not confirm whether these images depicted hikers, hunters, or the unknown male. No further campsites were found. No new notebook pages surfaced. The forest seemed to absorb the investigation the way it had absorbed the original disappearance. Emily continued therapy, slowly regaining physical strength. Her psychological recovery was long and uneven. She remembered surviving. She remembered someone near her. But she never remembered leaving the trail or why she couldn't escape. And without memory, the unknown male remained a shadow. Closing the investigative phase. By late 2019, Detective Mallory made his final entry. All available evidence indicates the victim survived under conditions of long-term isolation, likely maintained by an unidentified adult male. Investigation remains open. Subject remains at large. The truth was assembled but incomplete, like a puzzle with its center missing. Investigators could reconstruct how she survived. They could not reconstruct who kept her there, or why she was never found sooner, or where the man went when he left her to die. The forest had given just enough detail to confirm Emily's suffering, but not enough to deliver justice. By the time Emily Parker returned home to Flagstaff in late November of 2018, nearly 6 months had passed since her rescue from the drainage deep in the Tonto National Forest. Her parents, Ron and Linda Parker, had prepared a quiet room for her, a space filled with soft light, familiar furniture, and a sense of security she had not known for years. The transition was slow. Emily struggled with disorientation, occasional panic, and the weight of memories that refused to settle. She woke in the middle of the night, sitting by the window, tracing the dark outline of the trees beyond the yard, the forest still alive in her mind. Medical specialists and therapists continued working with her, focusing on grounding techniques and gradual reintroduction to daily life. Her physical strength returned steadily, her weight stabilized, hair regrew, and the scars on her hands and feet faded to pale lines. Yet the psychological and emotional wounds remained. Every sound, every rustle of the wind could transport her back to those 3 years she had spent under the watchful presence of an unknown individual in isolation. Investigators maintained a cautious engagement with Emily's recovery. Detective Frank Mallory, who had been assigned to her case from the beginning, remained in contact, checking in periodically, reviewing trail camera footage and monitoring any potential sightings of the unidentified male. Despite months of effort, the DNA recovered from the campsites did not match any records, and the handwriting from the notebook could not be definitively linked to a known individual. The perpetrator remained unidentified, and investigators acknowledged that he might never be located. The Tonto National Forest, sprawling nearly 3 million acres of rugged terrain, had swallowed the person into its vastness, leaving only a trail of fragmented clues behind. Even as the active investigation slowed, Emily began reclaiming parts of her life. She reconnected with her former roommate, Sarah Milton, who had never stopped hoping. Their reunion was quiet, filled with long pauses and careful words, but it was healing. Emily reached out to a few friends, though social interactions were measured. She still navigated the delicate line between connection and overwhelm. Each small step represented a reclaiming of autonomy, a necessary counterpoint to the years when her movements, choices, and perceptions had been controlled by circumstances beyond her understanding. The Parker family, along with close friends and a small circle of medical professionals, observed each milestone with quiet vigilance. Emily began taking short walks with her father along familiar paths near their home. The cold air, the scent of pine, and the soft shifting of sunlight through the branches offered reminders of the forest, but no longer as a prison. The Highline Trail, the starting point of her disappearance, became a place she could return to safely. First with supervision, then eventually alone, though always aware of the lingering sense of distance the past had imposed. In 2019, on the 4th anniversary of her disappearance, Emily and her family held a modest gathering. It was neither a celebration nor a memorial in the conventional sense. Friends, therapists, and investigators who had guided her journey attended. Emily spoke briefly, acknowledging the endurance required to survive and the uncertainty that would remain. She reflected on the forest as a dual symbol, a place of danger and isolation, yes, but also one of resilience and survival. She had endured, and that alone carried a significance deeper than any court judgment could impart. The investigative record remained open. Mallory ensured that surveillance and trail monitoring continued. Trail cameras occasionally captured fleeting figures moving through the area, obscured, shadowed, unidentifiable, but no evidence emerged linking anyone to Emily's captivity. Law enforcement, having reviewed the extensive documentation, concluded that the unknown male had acted with a disturbing mixture of restraint and control, maintaining her survival, but ensuring dependency and disorientation. Beyond this, his identity and fate remained unresolved. Emily's recovery was bolstered by her own initiatives. She enrolled in part-time online courses to refresh her skills in graphic design, working at her own pace. She began volunteering for organizations supporting survivors of prolonged captivity and trauma. In these roles, she shared fragments of her story, carefully emphasizing resilience, self-care, and the importance of support systems. Her voice, though measured, reached others in the community who had experienced trauma, creating a quiet legacy of hope and understanding. The broader community, already shaken by her disappearance, followed her recovery with measured attention. News coverage highlighted both the remarkable endurance required to survive alone in the wilderness for 3 years and the ongoing challenge of preventing similar situations. Authorities reviewed search protocols, noting that certain remote sections of the forest had been inadequately patrolled. Agencies updated guidelines for missing person searches, particularly in areas of difficult terrain where traditional search grids might fail. Despite the progress, unanswered questions persisted. The male presence in the forest, confirmed by DNA and behavioral evidence, had never been identified. Whether he remained in the wilderness, had left the state, or had died unknowingly remained unknown. Emily herself, though resilient, continued to navigate memory gaps, disorientation, and the psychological aftermath of long-term isolation. The truth of her experience was now documented, but some details, perhaps forever, would remain beyond reach. In 2023, Emily published a memoir working alongside Dr. Naomi Fletcher, her longtime trauma specialist. The book did not dominate bestseller lists, but it reached the audience it was intended for: survivors, families of missing persons, and professionals in mental health and law enforcement. She received letters from across the country, thank you notes, expressions of empathy and acknowledgement of the courage required to reclaim life after such an ordeal. Reading and responding to these letters became an additional layer of healing, providing purpose beyond her own recovery. The Parker family maintained rituals to mark her survival, small acknowledgments of progress rather than ceremonies of closure. Walks on the Highline Trail, quiet dinners by the window overlooking Flagstaff, and controlled exposure to the forest's landscape allowed Emily to reassert a sense of autonomy. She returned to familiar hiking routes only with companions and never retraced the path that had led to her disappearance. The forest itself remained vast and indifferent, an enduring reminder of the time that had been taken from her. Detective Mallory retired in 2022, but he ensured the case file remained active and entrusted it to a younger investigator who pledged ongoing attention. The trail cameras stayed in place and occasional motion detections were logged, but no further contacts were made. The forest retained its secrets. Emily accepted that some truths who held her why she remained unseen, what exactly transpired in the earliest months of her isolation, might never be fully revealed. She had survived. She had reclaimed her life. And in that she had achieved a form of closure no investigation alone could provide. In the quiet moments of late 2023, Emily walked the Highline Trail once more. Alone, aware, cautious, she reached the clearing where she had first paused with her father years earlier. She sat on the same flat rock gazing across the valley. The sun shifted slowly behind the pines, casting long shadows over ridges she had once feared. She breathed in the cool air, felt the texture of the rock beneath her hands, and allowed herself to acknowledge the distance she had traveled not merely in miles or terrain, but through years of uncertainty, deprivation, and trauma. The forest remained as it had always been, vast, indifferent, and unmoving. Yet Emily sat upright, scarred, but intact. She had confronted the wilderness, the time it had taken, and the person whose presence had shadowed her existence. She had survived. She had returned. And she had chosen to live beyond the forest's silent judgment. Justice in the legal sense had not been delivered. The perpetrator remained unidentified. But in the measurable, tangible sense, the reclaiming of a body, a mind, and a life closure had been achieved. Emily Parker's story became a testament to human endurance, the resilience of the mind, and the subtle ways communities, families, and investigative agencies can respond when ordinary procedures are insufficient. The case remained open. Investigators maintained their patrols, but Emily had moved forward carrying the forest in memory, the years in her body, and a future that, while uncertain, was now wholly hers. The legacy of her survival was not just in headlines or forensic reports, it was in the daily reclamation of life, in the work to rebuild trust, to navigate memory gaps, and to embrace freedom in measured, deliberate steps. And in that quiet, deliberate reclaiming, Emily Parker found the balance between remembrance and recovery, proving that even after 3 years lost to isolation, a life can be reclaimed, measured not in days gone, but in every choice taken from that day forward.